Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is John McDougall. I am the event coordinator here at Murder by the Book, and we're super excited about tonight's event. But before we get into it, I just want to make some general store announcements, let you guys know what's going on with us. So as I'm sure if you've been watching our virtual events, you know we've had a nice full week. We've got a good, I think something every day next week except Tuesday. And a pretty full following week as well. I think we're about done adding new things to the calendar for 2021. The plan is for the rest of the year, we're going to do all virtual stuff. And then fingers crossed, we're hoping that we'll be able to get some authors in store next year for 2022. And then we'll also figure out a way to still do some virtual stuff and in-store hybrid stuff. So that's definitely all on the agenda for next year. We've got a couple of potential local author things set up for January that we're hoping once we get through the holidays that we'll be able to do those. So if you have not come to visit us lately, please come check us out at the store. We are open. We are asking that you mask up when you come in. As we've mentioned before, we have, with kids not being able to get vaccinated yet, we have a lot of families that come in. We also have a lot of customers that come and visit us while they are at MD Anderson getting treatment. We just want to make sure that everybody feels safe and comfortable in the store. If you are not getting out and about and you still prefer curbside pickup, you can always give us a call when you are pulling into the parking lot. We're happy to run books out to you. As I mentioned, we've got a nice full event schedule next week. Next Wednesday, you're going to be chatting with Steph Mullen and Nicole Mabry. They're going to be in conversation with Megan Collins about their new book. Next Thursday, we're really excited. It's going to be the first of our Crime Writers of Color reading series. We're really excited to partner with them in last month when VoucherCon got canceled. They were supposed to have a reception and we were able to do a virtual version of that. And out of that has spun this every other month reading series that we're going to be doing with them. Kelly Garrett and Alex Segura are going to be our hosts. Every other month, they're going to pick a different theme. October's theme is Edge of Your Seat Thrillers. So that is going to be next Thursday, the 21st at 7 Central. So we hope that you guys will check us out for that. I also wanted to mention, we're going to bring Steph out in just a second, but she was one of the editors of the Best American Mystery and Suspense 2021 collection that came out on Tuesday. We did a really great event with her Tuesday night, and Alex Segura, Alafair Burke, Nikki Dolson, and Laura Lippman. So if you guys missed that and you want to check it out, it is up on the store's YouTube channel, as well as a wealth of the other author events that we have done since the pandemic started. So we hope that you will check those out. But for tonight, I'm going to get us started. I'm going to start with Steph and bring her out. How are you tonight, Steph?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for having me again.
Thanks for doing this for us.
Oh yeah, my pleasure.
As we were mentioning before we went live, you reminded me that we got to see you in the store in 2019 towards the end of the year. And as I said, it feels like that was so long ago. We haven't had an author in the store since March of last year. So we're definitely excited to be able to get people back in the store at some point.
Yeah, I missed bookstore events.
And so, as I mentioned, Steph just co-edited the Best American Mystery and Suspense 2021 collection with Alafair Burke. And then her book, Your House Will Pay, just came out in paperback last summer. Let me get her full official bio here pulled up. So Steph Cha is the author of Your House Will Pay, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and California Book Award, and the Juniper Song crime trilogy. She's a critic whose work has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, and Los Angeles Review of Books, where she served as noir editor and is current series editor of the Best American and Mystery Suspense Anthology. A native of the San Fernando Valley, she lives in Los Angeles with her family. And tonight she is going to be chatting with James Han Mattson, whose book Reprieve came out last Tuesday. And we're excited to have him. Let me bring him out. How are you tonight, James?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Congrats on the new book.
Hey, thank you.
So James Han Mattson is the acclaimed author of The Lost Prayers of Ricky Graves, a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He is the recipient of the awards from the Copernicus Society of America, the Human-ities, North Dakota. He was a featured storyteller on The Moth and has taught writing at the University of Iowa, the University of Cape Town, the George Washington University, the University of Maryland, Murray State University, and the University of California-Berkeley. He is currently the fiction editor of Hyphen magazine, and he was born in Seoul, Korea, and was raised in North Dakota. As I mentioned, his new book, Reprieve, has just come out. So while James and Steph are chatting this evening, if you guys watching out there have questions, please post those in the comments on Facebook or the live chat on YouTube, and we will get to them in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to James and Steph, and I will see you guys in just a little bit.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to chatting, but I think first, maybe you'd like to read a little bit from your new book, show off some of that writing.
Sure, I can do that. The section that I'm going to read, I need to set you up just a little bit. There is a character named Kendra who moves to Nebraska from Washington, D.C., and she gets involved with this place called the Quigley House, which is a full contact haunted attraction. She ends up becoming like a parking lot attendant at this place. She gets through the whole season and the fall season, and at the end of the season, they have this big party. And the section that I'm going to read it takes place at that party and a little bit later. Some characters you need to know. Christy is one of her coworkers. She's also a parking lot attendant. And then John Forrester is the proprietor of the full contact haunted attraction. So let me read this section. All right. Before Kendra could object further, Christy grabbed her hand and pulled her through the kitchen into the adjoining hall, where she was suddenly surrounded by dark, the hall lit only by seeping moonlight. Her airways constricted. She concentrated on her breath. 2 doors on the west wall stood ajar. One led to a storage room, one to a closet. Christy, her smile gleaming, chose the door to the storage room. I should also say that she's never been to the haunt. She's only been able to do the parking lot stuff because she is underage, so they're kind of sneaking right now. Careful, Christy said. Her voice came from below. She was kneeling. Watch your step. Kendra heard a creak. I can't see, she said. Isn't there a light? No, Christy said. Here, take my hand. It's a trap door. Be careful. Kendra descended a series of metal steps, each footfall unsteady, clanging. Grab the rail, Christy said. If we can't see anything, what's the point? She said, grabbing the rail. We'll see things, Christy said. Once we're down there, I'll find the light. Marcus showed me. Once they both stood on solid ground, Christy said into the dark, just wait here, don't move. Kendra waited by the stairs, holding onto the rail, ready to bolt. The air was damp. She felt suddenly that she was violating an important trust. I'm going back up, she called to the darkness. Wait, Kendra, Christy said from somewhere remote. A long wheeze sounded above, and then white light. Kendra shielded her eyes. Aha, Christy said, there we go. Kendra blinked, looked around, her hand still firmly wrapped around the handrail. The room was impossibly large, empty, and gray. A scoreboard was mounted on one wall, turned off. Around her, she felt movement. Rats, mice, snakes. In each corner sat a miniature jail cell, iron bars connected to concrete. In the northeast cell was a shadowy human figure seated in a red folding chair, its face obscured by a green gas mask. Holy shit, Kendra said. Don't worry, Christy said, standing a few feet from the cell. It's just a prop. Christy walked into the cell. Her steps echoed. She became small. Well, hello there, Mr. Mask, she shouted. Aren't you a scary, scary thing? She giggled, patted the top of the figure's mask. Very, very scary. Kendra shook her head. She knew from movies that this was the point where they were supposed to play around with the monster in the chair. Christy, the pretty blonde, would talk to it suggestively, maybe give it a lap dance, while Kendra, the no-nonsense black character, would say, I wouldn't do that, please don't. Minutes later, the monster/killer would disappear, only to reappear behind them with a weapon, slashing to pieces the black character who'd ultimately been deemed inessential to the storyline. Christy looked out at Kendra, put her hands on her hips. Jesus, Kendra, she said, are you just going to stand by the stairs? I mean, you wanted to see, so look around. It's a little ridiculous, isn't it? Look how low budget everything is. Just a room with 4 little jail cells. But this is what, cell 5? If anyone gets here, they're pretty beaten up already. And it's pitch black, and everyone goes mad in pitch black. The figure stood up. Kendra screamed. Then she laughed. Lone Tree, she said, is that you? The figure towered over Christy. It wore bib overalls, a flannel shirt, work boots, all streaked with blood. Christy turned around. The figure stretched out his arms, lifted Christy by the shoulders. Christy squirmed, her feet jerking in the air. Yes, very impressive, Kendra said. She looked up the stairs, chuckled. But don't worry, Christy. You and I both know that the black one always dies first. She thought then of The Shining, the movie she forever associated with this sort of tokenism. It'd been the biggest disappointment of her entire movie-watching career to see Dick Hallorann axed by Jack Torrance. Hallorann, a black man who'd had the gift of The Shining, who'd communicated cosmically with Danny Torrance, who'd been en route to enacting full-fledged heroism, had met his demise not 5 minutes after he'd arrived at the Overlook Hotel. 5 minutes. His single line inside the hotel had been, "Hello? Anybody here?" "Kendra," Christy shouted. "Help!" "I'll get right on that," Kendra said, grinning. "Hold tight." Sean had turned angry at the Hallorann murder scene. He'd said, "I'd rather they just not put a black person in the movie than have them die so meaninglessly every time." "But everyone dies meaninglessly," Kendra had said, though she too felt gutted. "You know it's different," he'd said, his face long and fuming. "You know it's not the same thing at all." In the jail cell, the killer man's masked face was inches from Christie's, peering thoughtfully. Christy screamed. Kendra felt momentarily unsettled. "Kendra," Christy said, "please." The man in the mask whipped Christy against the bars. Kendra flinched. "Just take off his mask," Kendra said, mentally inventorying everyone she'd seen at the party. "Kendra," Christy said. She was on the floor now, having somehow gotten free from the monster's clutches. She was crawling away, slowly. "Help!" "Christy," Kendra said, her stomach nodding. "Really, this isn't funny. This isn't—" "Just help," she said. "My leg. I can't move." Christy edged out of the cell, tried to stand up, but fell. The masked man looked at her, cocked his head. "Jesus," Kendra said. She looked at the stairs, then back at Christy. "I guess we're playing this game." She ran to her coworker, bent down, put her arm around her shoulders. When they were halfway across the room, wheezing, grunting, sweating, the stairs folded up into the ceiling. Whap. Kendra turned around. The masked man moved slowly. In his hand, Kendra now saw a weapon, a glistening silver hatchet. "No," Kendra said. "Seriously?" Sweat ran down her forehead. Christy was heavy on her arm. "Kendra," Christy whispered, "my leg, I think it's broken." The man stomped closer. Kendra's hands shook. What the fuck, she thought. Next to her, Christy's breathing became labored, moistened her neck. Kendra surveyed the room. About 50 feet away was a door. "Is that where we go?" she said. "Kendra," Christy said. Kendra pulled on her coworker, but her weight was too much. "Come on," Kendra said, thinking again of Sean. Would she ever see him again? Or would she die down here, a pathetic virgin? Would she? No, none of this was real. It couldn't be. This was a game. From behind her, she heard grunts, the slow-moving gait of a bloodied man in a mask. "Everyone in horror movies should always err on the side of caution," Sean had said during one of their early horror club meetings. "It's their disbelief that gets them killed in the end." "Christy," Kendra said, panting, "did he actually hurt you?" Christy didn't answer, just let out a terrific scream. "Oh, fuck, my leg! Oh, fuck. I can't hold you up much more," Kendra said. "You have to. You need to be honest with me here," Kendra said. "Oh, God, we're going to die," Christy said. "We're going to die." Kendra stopped. Now she knew. There'd been no need to err on the side of caution. Disbelief wouldn't get her killed. She probably wouldn't die a virgin. She looked down at Christy's face and saw, through the mess of tangled hair, a monstrous grin. "Just save yourself," Christy said, draping a hand over her forehead. "Save yourself." "I knew it," Kendra said, and dropped Christy, who stood up perfectly fine on her own. The monster took off his mask. "Yep," Kendra said, "of course." John Forster shrugged, smiled. "You like the night vision mask? Military grade. And this hatchet looks so real, doesn't it?" He ran a finger across the edge. "Plastic. All an illusion, Kendra," he said. "Everything." The stairs dropped back down. Kendra ran to them, looked up, and saw Sarah peering down at her, grinning. "Take off his mask," Sarah chided. "Just take off his mask." "I'll give you a proper tour soon," John said, walking over to her. "You've definitely earned that." Kendra shook her head. "I never thought any of it was real," she said. "Just take off his mask," Sarah repeated. "Take off his mask." Soon the rest of the crew stood around Sarah, joining the chant. "Take off his mask. Take off his mask." Kendra climbed the steps, still shaking her head. Dark heat swirled around her cheeks and ears. But when she reached the hallway and saw Sarah's pointy face smiling into hers, Scratchy embarrassment immediately reverted to cool, easy friendship. Who'd have thought, she wondered, me with a white girl feeling mushy. Who'd have thought? She hugged Sarah. Sarah hugged back. I'm so glad to have met you, Sarah said. I'm glad too, Kendra said. Christy and John joined them in the hall, both of them beaming. John put his hand on Kendra's shoulder and said, your family. I know, Kendra said, I get it. Your family, John repeated. And she felt in that moment like she could possibly leave her entire DC life behind her. If she had this, if she had Quigley, she could maybe fashion an existence for herself here. She could maybe survive. I think I'll stop there. That's okay.
That was great. I really love this passage because it encapsulated so much of what is interesting about this book. You know, I'm thinking particularly of this kind of layering of real and unreal, you know, because it's like, so for those of you who haven't been able to read it yet or don't know what it's about, it kind of takes place in this full contact haunted house. And there's obviously illusion involved in the haunted house, but the frame story, which you know from page 1, is that a very real violent crime happened in this haunted house. So there's this kind of melding of genres, and you know, this and you know, Kendra and JD, and you know, there are these characters too who are kind of tasked with figuring out what's real and what isn't real, you know, in their day to day. And I felt like a lot of that kind of came through in this passage. Anyway, I do want to talk about a lot of what I just mentioned, but I'll start by asking, because I'm curious, why Nebraska 1997?
Well, two things. That's two questions. Nebraska. I lived in Nebraska for 4 years, and in Lincoln. I think Nebraska in general is a very spooky state. I mean, Nebraska and Kansas are kind of similar in the sense that like it's sort of endless cornfields once you get out of the cities. And there's a reason that a movie and story like Children of the Corn really like resonates with people, because it's like that sense of isolation and dreariness. I mean, there's a lot of like red barns and like nice rolling hills and everything during the day, which I think is really picturesque. But I think at night, like it becomes just kind of it can become a spooky place. The rural areas, not necessarily the cities. The 90s, I picked it for a few reasons. I mean, I kind of came of age in the 90s. I was, I was in high school and in college during the 90s. It's kind of where my love of horror solidified in a sense, even though I did like horror before, but like when I was in high school and college, it kind of like crystallized, I guess. And the 90s were like a really interesting time for horror because they were flanked by these two enormous decades that each had their own ideas of horror. So like the 80s and like the 70s or whatever, they had like all the slashers that came out. And that was like a big deal in the 80s, you know, all these slasher flicks, like, you know, Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween, you know, all of those came out, you know, in the 80s and 70s. And then in the 90s, you had this, like the surgence of like torture porn, but also like found footage stuff, which you didn't really get much in the 90s. So the 90s was like an interesting combination of everything, because you had like really smart horror, I think, like, you know, something like Jacob's Ladder or something, I think is like a really, really smart horror. But then you also had kind of the bubblegum stuff that happened later, like Scream. And I think it was just an interesting decade for horror. And I just, you know, so those are sort of the reasons I chose the place and time for this book.
I remember when I read this book, because I read this book a while ago, because I read an early copy. But I remember looking up full contact haunted houses, you know, because I was like, oh, is this like a thing? Like how invasive are they allowed to get? You know, I mean, it's such an interesting conceit, and I was looking for a possible, you know, kind of real world antecedent for this. Is there one? Is Quigley House based on any place in particular?
I mean, it's based on a number of places, but there are quite a few full contact haunts, but they run the gamut in terms of severity. I mean, like you have full contact, they call them full contacts. in places like Knott's Scary Farm. I mean, it's not like, but they're not, I mean, when I say full contact, what I mean is like you might have someone like reaching out and grabbing you from the dark or something. You might get like a tiny little electric shock or something. They're not terrible. And then you have other places that are full on, like you have to sign a waiver. There's like, it's essentially like torture, you know?
Yeah, it sounded really, like, the stuff in this book sounded so intense and painful. I was like, oh, this is something people sign up for.
Yeah, I know. I was so shocked by that myself. I mean, that's sort of why I became obsessed with it, because I couldn't like imagine people wanting to do this, but it's a huge underground industry. But I mean, there are places where they simulate waterboarding, you know, and there are places
that's like offensive.
Yeah. There are places that you go in for hours and hours, you know, and, you know, people sign up for this stuff. It's not something I would do. I mean, people always ask. But it was like,
oh, you didn't research this. This didn't come from doing a series of full contact houses, or
I'm okay with not. Yeah, I'm totally okay with not doing it myself.
Yeah, it was like very vividly. It was very vividly written. Yeah, I was actually curious about that. If you had delved into any of it yourself.
I had I had no desire to do it.
So was that the original seed of this book then, the idea of the full contact haunted house, or what, or did that become a vessel for something you were already ruminating on?
Well, actually what happened is I had two very different stories going on simultaneously. I wouldn't say they're two complete novels or anything, but they're two distinct stories. When I started this book, I wanted to write about racial fetishism. That was the idea that I had in my head that I wanted to illustrate. And, you know, racial fetishism is on such brazen display in Thailand. So I started writing a book that took place in the, you know, the sex tourism industry in Bangkok and Pattaya. And then I got like kind of interested in the research on Thailand in general. And I sort of veered off into other avenues. But, you know, at some point I was like, this is kind of, I lost, you know, a bit of interest in what I was writing. But at the same time I was writing that, I was also researching these full contact haunts. And as soon as I found out about that, I wanted to write about it because I was just like, this is like totally nuts. And I need to like, this is like totally right for fiction. So I started writing a story about John Forrester, who is the proprietor of the Quigley House. That's the full contact haunt in my book. And, you know, it was going well, but I also had this other Thailand book that I was working on. And at some point I realized that thematically they tied in so well.
Yeah.
The idea of racial fetishism, is sort of like the stripping away of humanity, and the idea of horror also strips away humanity, because you can't really enjoy horror unless you kind of take away the humanity of the victim. Unless you're sociopathic, like, yeah, then I'm sure you can enjoy it, or sadistic in some way. But most of us aren't. And a lot of us enjoy horror. So one of the reasons is we're able to dissociate. And so I thought the thematic ties between the Thailand story and the Quigley House story worked really well. Getting the plots to match up was a little bit more difficult. It took a lot of like revision, but I'm happy with how it turned out. I just think thematically they work together.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear that these were two completely different projects, because they didn't feel that way. I feel like you know, the plot work was really well done. It's actually like, I'm thinking back on it, it's actually like a fairly elaborate plot that feels pretty seamlessly executed, like, which is actually not that easy to pull off. But I found it very convincing, and I found the pieces to fit together really nicely, you know, on like a plot and thematic level, you know, because I think another thing about, you know, when you're talking about racial fetishism and this horror house, you know, this idea of projection and constructing realities. And, you know, because I think like one of the scariest things in this book is the way that Leonard is able to manufacture an entire romance with this this very young Thai prostitute that just doesn't exist. It doesn't, it like, you know, it's this, and you occupy Leonard's point of view in this very, very like full way, so that, you know, we see what he perceives as reality. We see what reality he's trying to put into the world, and like rope this poor woman into, and also kind of the ropes that are being pulled to like make him believe these things. And it has kind of all of the structure of a constructed reality, like a haunted house. I mean, so I thought that worked really well. Thank you. I don't know if you had anything to say about that, but so if you do, like, please talk about it. But in case I'm leaving you with like a really weird question, I'm also going to ask, you know, can you talk about like where you see this book fitting in terms of genre? Like, is this something you think about? I think The Lost Prayers of Ricky Graves was also kind of a mixed genre, like, but crimey novel, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, going back to the character of Leonard, just so if people don't know who Leonard is, and this isn't really a spoiler, Leonard is the perpetrator of the crime. I mean, you know that pretty early on, so I'm not spoiling anything. He's the one who actually breaks into the Quigley house and murders somebody. So, I mean, I think that's like really interesting, like your take on him. And that, I just want to mention like the relationship between him and Poonsi, who is this Thai prostitute that you were talking about, was really difficult to write, simply because I had to write it, like you said, completely from his perspective, and he was totally stripping the humanity from her, because he liked what she represented to him, but didn't really care about who she was in general. And so there is one paragraph where I was just like, this is too much. I need to like enter her head, because in one of the original versions, she was one of the main characters. So I knew her really well. Yeah. She was
of the like separate novel.
Yeah, in the separate novel, she was like one of the main characters. And so I knew her really well. And to like not be able to get inside of her head and to not be able to like afford her that humanity was really difficult for me, because Leonard is sort of, I mean, he was really awful at that point. But I needed to stick with him. But there is one point in the narrative where I break and I say, like, I need to talk about her. I need to talk about her in a more enriching way. And that was really nice for me to be able to do that. It's only a couple paragraphs long, but it's like, it was really important for me to have that in the book. As far as genre crossing and like how I see this book, I mean, I think it's being publicized as horror and thriller, and I understand that. I don't know if I went into it thinking I'm going to write a horror. Like I said, I had these ideas that I wanted to illustrate more so. And the horror was something that I enjoyed. I mean, I enjoyed reading horror. I enjoyed watching horror. And so it became more of a vehicle to discuss these ideas. But I can see, because, a lot of the book is pretty creepy. So I can see how people would think, this is a horror novel, or this might be like a thriller novel or something. But I mean, in general, that wasn't my intent,
Yeah, I feel like it. I certainly didn't read it as a horror novel. It felt to me like a crime novel about a crime novel that like is also about horror, which I found interesting. There's some interesting scaffolding there. It's like it's also a social novel, and I do think, and I have some bias here, but I do think that crime fiction, and I think horror too, like genre fiction, I feel like we have more of a free hand to like tackle social issues, particularly in stories of somebody dies, right? I mean, in this case, it's a black teenage boy at the hands of a white man, right? And so there's just the political implications of that, the social implications of that, are just really hard to ignore, and I know you come from a very literary background. I think you went to Iowa Writers Workshop, yeah. and I was wondering if this is like, I was wondering about how you like think about genre, and kind of if you think like the crime of it, helped you tell these particular stories.
Yeah, I mean, how I think about genre, I just wrote a piece for Crime Reads on this exact subject, and it's something that's always bothered me just a little bit. This the pigeonholing of like books based on, certain elements of the plot. And like, it's not as bad anymore in bookstores, but there used to be like horror sections in bookstores, particularly in the large bookstores like Barnes and Noble. They got rid of those. But they still have they still have sci-fi and fantasy, which I understand. People who are sci-fi and fantasy enthusiasts, that they want to go to their particular sections. They don't want to weed through all this other fiction. But I think like the idea that something has to be pigeonholed into horror or even sci-fi or fantasy and not be called literary and not be talked about as literary is sort of strange to me.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, because I mean, I think there's a lot of really, I mean, I think what people think of when they think of literary is they think of like these really well written sort of family drama type things that aren't necessarily page turners, that you like want to sit with, maybe the language and essentially not as plot driven as genre fiction. And I guess there's some reality to that, but I mean, there's also not. I mean, there's a lot of books that are incredibly fast page turners that would be considered literary, and there are a lot of books that are really slow that are considered genre. So
yeah, no, it's a subject matter thing, and I think like it's it can certainly be frustrating for I feel like a lot of the books that I tend to gravitate towards are kind of those tweener books, because I very much value good writing and good style, but I also appreciate a plot. And I think that there's this idea that plot is dirty, but I also think but everybody says there's the snobbery around plot, doesn't extend to character. Everyone says, oh, character first, character is so important. But I just don't understand this separation of character and plot, because if plot is what characters do, then isn't plot also a key part of exploring character? I mean, that's just my 2 cents on that matter, but I don't know. I like the ability to have it both ways, and I feel like your book does that.
Yeah. I mean, I like that too. I mean, I think some people think, like I said, literary fiction is just ruminations. The character building is done through interiority, and what they actually do doesn't matter as much as what they're thinking and what they're feeling. But I mean, I think most good books have characters do things and get into all sorts of trouble.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Speaking of characters getting in trouble, when you were talking about Leonard and is it Punchi?
Punci, yeah. No, there's an R in it, but it's silent.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know how to pronounce it. But there's an interesting funhouse mirror thing going, with the relationship between JD and his like English teacher, right?
Yeah.
Because like JD is somebody who's like at times like incredibly frustrating, and also you like and also you want to like protect him, you know, which is not how I felt about Leonard, you know. But there is the same kind of like projection involved, and you know, to a lesser extent, you have Kendra, who has this murky relationship with this guy in DC who's like obsessed with the Quigley house. And you know, can you talk a little about that? Can you talk about JD in particular, and that relationship, because I found that to be like really fascinating. And he's also somebody we see, you know, in different stages of his life. And yeah, and also just this the weaving in of these like, because it's kind of like this funhouse of love stories in addition to this like these cells of horror.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, that was intentional. I think like, so just to give anybody who doesn't know who JD is, he is a gay Thai international student, and he had a white English teacher in Thailand who he became sort of obsessed with, and he came to the States essentially to find this white English teacher in Nebraska. The guy's name is Victor, the white English teacher, and he ends up moving to Des Moines, and JD ends up eventually, you know, finding him. But the thing about JD is that how he developed his crush on Victor was completely predicated on his obsession with American television, and his ideas of what is desirable and what he should, you know, what is desirable came from watching a lot of American television, and also reading, you know, to a lesser extent, reading American novels, where, you know, the white protagonist is always the hero. And so when he's a teenager, he sort of formulates this idea that his life will only be complete if he has like a white American man in his life. And that's one of the reasons, or that's really the only reason he comes to the States, even though he, you know, it's under the guise of him going to college in Nebraska. So what I wanted to focus on there is just this idea of media and media saturation infiltrating our own desires, you know, like because we're so saturated with media, and because the media depicts, you know, whiteness as this thing to strive for a lot of people, that becomes personal, and that becomes like, you know, what they want in their lives. It becomes like, this is what I need to have, you know, a white partner. I need to have like, you know, whiteness around me. And that's what JD sort of falls prey to in the book. And on the flip side, you know, when you're talking about the funhouse mirror, you have Leonard, who goes over to Thailand, and he's this white person, and he feels completely ostracized in the U.S. He's had this relationship with this woman that didn't go very well. And so he goes over to Thailand, and he feels needed. He feels wanted. He feels like, you know, this is how it should be. You know, he's a very entitled person. And so because he has these things essentially at his fingertips, and because he's like seen by a lot of the people in the industry, in the sex tourism industry, as like rich, even though he's not rich, he feels important, and he's never felt important before, you know, and he suddenly has this, you know, beautiful young woman like paying a lot of attention to him, and he thinks of this as love. So what's going on then is like neither Leonard and Poonsi or JD and Victor are actually there's no love there, there's no actual love between any of those people, but they think they are. They have these ideas that this is what love is. And it takes, and Leonard unfortunately never figures it out, but JD does at the end. I'm sorry, that was kind of a spoiler, but
it's big enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which of these characters came to you first?
I think because I was doing the Thai book first, JD was always there, but he was a completely different character. He wasn't even gay. He was Poonsi's brother, and he gets involved with the South Thai separatist insurgency, and it was a completely different novel. But the fundamentals, I guess, of his character were there, and he was the first one that I really fleshed out.
Oh, that's interesting. I would not have guessed that based on based on what you said about that first novel. What was it about him that stayed kind of true? Like, was he always like kind of yearning for America? Like,
he wasn't really yearning. Yeah, I wouldn't say he was yearning for America so much as yearning for something outside of how he lived. So I mean, it's in that edition, which just seems so long ago. He like has this reaction to his Buddhist upbringing, and it's just completely different. I mean, like like when I say like some of the remnants are still there, they're very minor. I mean, he's almost a completely different character.
But he's a guy who struggles against like the place he's from, which is an interesting character. I mean, and that is like something that's very memorable about him. Who's your favorite? or two separate questions.
Okay.
Who's your favorite, and who was your favorite to write?
Ooh, those are good questions. Because I would say Kendra is my favorite. But Kendra was the most difficult to write. I spent the most time on her. She was very hard. And like, she was not a character that showed up until like a few drafts in, and she was a minor character. She was Corey's next door neighbor. Corey is an employee at the Quigley House. So she was Corey's next door neighbor in one of the earlier drafts. And I had this scene with her where she's locked out of her apartment complex, and she's just sitting on the stoop. And Corey comes by, and he's just like, "What's wrong? Why are you sitting out here at 2 a.m?" And that's how she gets involved with the Quigley House. It's different now, but that's how she got involved. But she was still a very minor character. But I really just loved her so much, and I just loved how she acted with everybody at Quigley, that I wanted to make her a major character, and I did. She takes up pretty much the biggest sections of the book now.
Yeah.
But she was definitely hard to. She was hard to write because she was the most outside of my own experience, my own identity, however you'd say it.
Yeah, I mean, like a very young Black woman from DC.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, she was convincing. I found her really. She's probably my favorite character. She's the most likable, and she feels the most like a reader stand-in,
Yeah.
Like I could see myself being in her shoes, like getting seduced by the scene, getting horrified by the scene, and all of her kind of family and relationship stuff was so like, there was an immediacy that, made me remember being young and uncertain all the time. Yeah, I thought she was great. So who was your favorite to write then?
My favorite to write, or the easiest to write? A favorite?
Both, let's say. Okay.
The easiest to write was Leonard. And that's because it's funny because I remember telling my editor, like on one of the first calls we had, we talked about Leonard. She's like, how did you write him? I was just like, I know so many people. I know so many Leonards. And so, how I grew up, where I grew up, and like, it's not that mentality is not that new to me. So it was pretty easy to write. It wasn't very fun a lot of times. So when you asked like if he was fun to write, no, it wasn't that fun. Like the whole time that he was in Thailand was not fun to write. But I understood I understood his mentality, so it wasn't difficult. It wasn't very fun.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely you access something, like you must have some level of empathy for this character, because I ended up feeling bad for him, like he's not somebody who, I think he's gross, but he's not somebody I think is like completely without, I feel bad for him.
Yeah. I hope, because like at the beginning, like he has this relationship with this woman, and all of his insecurities kind of come out in this relationship with this woman, and like he's so worried about losing her, and like the worst thing that could happen is like losing her, and that's something I think like I wanted to infuse like a humanity about him into that beginning part of his section, but like the most fun to write. I don't know, John Forrester. And I say that only because in earlier drafts, he took up a lot more space. And I had he had his own sections.
Okay, I was going to say, we don't go into his POV, right?
No, we don't go into his POV at all. He's much more distant now. And he's almost, I don't know, sort of allegorical, like a symbol. He doesn't have like the fleshed out backstories at all that others do. But when I was writing him, when I was getting to know him, I did flesh him out. I did get his backstories. And the thing that was fun about writing him was that I got to write about starting a haunt. And that was something that I was sort of obsessed with. I was obsessed with like, these full contact haunts and how they came about and how people, why people go to them. And so as I was writing his backstory, I was learning sort of, how to become a proprietor of one of these things. I should mention too, that I actually worked for two guys for 2 summers, who had a haunt. I didn't work in their haunt. Yeah, they had a winery that I worked at, so I mostly just. But they also were starting they'd had a haunt before, and they told me all about it and all the conventions and all the stuff they went to, but they were also starting a new haunt in Southern Maryland, and it's in this big huge shed in the field. And they gave me a good tour of it and told me gave me some tips on like illusions and stuff, and that was really fun. That was really fun to learn. But all of that got chopped from the book. Like it became it. I didn't want this book to be about starting a haunt.
Yeah, no, I get it. You have to do all the research and then you have to throw a lot of it away.
Yeah.
I guess we're almost at the 50-minute mark now. So if anyone has questions, I just wanted to, throw out the opportunity to ask them. But if not, we can just keep talking.
All right. Okay. So before we get into questions, Steph, you've been so great to lead this conversation tonight. Can you tell everybody a little bit about Your House Will Pay and maybe a little bit about the Best American Mystery and Suspense Anthology?
Oh, yeah, sure. Your House Will Pay came out a couple years ago now. I actually just realized this was my pub week 2 years ago. Okay. It's and I said before when I was talking about genre and I think of it as a social crime novel. That's like how I define like this, and I kind of feel like Reprieve is in the same vein, but it's a LA novel that deals with kind of tension, like racial tension, particularly between the Korean American and Black communities in LA. And it looks at kind of the ties between, like police violence in the 90s in LA and present day. Although this was I wrote it between 2014 and 2019. The Best American Anthology, which I hope all of you will check out because it features 20 of the finest voices in short mystery fiction. This is my first year as series editor, and I edited it with guest editor Alifair Burke, and we put together what I think is a really amazing collection from just like a great variety of voices. It's perfect. It's a perfect thing to just have and take a bite of here and there. I mean, I just think these writers have done such fine work, and I'm excited for some of them are very well known writers, like we have Laura Lippman and Alex Segura and Lisa Unger in there, but a lot of them you might not have read before, and I think they're really worth checking out.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me do my plug.
Oh, of course. So James, can you tell us a little bit about how the book came to be titled Reprieve? That's such a good title.
Yeah, I always knew that the book was going to be titled Reprieve. I didn't really know that was going to be the safe word in the haunted house. But I wanted to talk about like a specific place where people needed a reprieve from like getting battered, physically battered, like a full contact haunt. Like, I guess, juxtaposed with people needing a reprieve from the horrors of their everyday life. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was just like the word that came to my mind when I was writing this book. And, I didn't make it the safe word until later, but it made sense after a while.
Awesome. And can you tell us a little bit about the cover design as well? Because the cover is also just fantastic and creepy.
Yes, the cover is amazing. I mean, we went through a bunch of covers, and we had this artist. Actually, I'm forgetting. She's Korean. I'm sorry, this is terrible, but I'm blanking on the name right now. But I do want to look it up. Actually, I don't have it right now. Anyway, she's done art for like a whole bunch of different places, books, magazines, etc. And like it's all of her artwork is very I don't want to use the word eerie, but in a way, I guess that's not the right word. And I'm kind of blanking on the word that I want to use right now to describe her artwork, but it's beautiful. All of the stuff that she's done is pretty amazing. I'm sorry that I blanked on her name right now. But I think is in the book. I'm not sure where I would find it though.
So while he's looking at that, Steph, what is something that you've read lately that you've loved?
Oh, Ho Kyung Kim. Sorry.
Ho Kyung Kim. Oh, okay, I found it. Yeah. Something that I've read lately that I've loved. Let me think. Other than Reprieve, I just finished a book called Golden State by Lydia Kiesling. That was just amazing. It's a novel about motherhood, and she's just a really great writer. She's actually somebody I met once, and I follow her on Twitter, and she's like really funny, and it turned out like I really liked her book too. So that's something I read recently that I just thought was fantastic. I also just actually for the mystery crowd, I just read Fingersmith for the first time, which I thought was fantastic. That was a really, really fun book.
And for those watching, I'm dropping links to both of those in the comments. So if anybody wants to check those out. How about you, James? What have you read lately that you liked?
Well, I just read Your House Will Pay. And I loved it. Yeah, and I wanted to like mention because you had talked a little bit about interweaving plots. And I think like you do that so seamlessly with Grace and Sean's like sort of disparate storylines. The way that they weave together is pretty, like, it didn't seem forced at all. And I really appreciated that, because it sort of reminded me of like, all the fiction that I love that brings these, disparate storylines together in some interesting and sometimes unusual ways. I also just read The Upstairs House by Julia Fine, which I thought was so weird, but so gripping. And yeah, so that's gonna be my plug. It's weird and gripping, and like I just tore through it.
You said that was Julia Fine. That's the author.
Julia Fine, yeah, The Upstairs House.
Awesome. And so I know, James, that you just had a book come out a couple weeks ago, but what are you working on now?
I'm working on another novel. It's very different from what it's very different from Reprieve. It's more personal in the sense that it does have some things to do with my own biography, in that there's a character that's a Korean adoptee who goes back to Korea, and she doesn't find her birth family like I did, but she ends up getting involved with these like feng shui enthusiasts. And when I say feng shui, I don't mean like, rearranging furniture. I mean, finding auspicious grave sites. And so it's dark, because there's also another part of the story that's like a ghost story, and it follows these paranormal investigators in Minnesota. So it's sort of in the same vein, in that there's two very different stories that merge together, but like the merging itself is not nearly as difficult as it was for Reprieve.
And how about you, Steph? What are you working on?
I'm noodling with the beginnings of another novel. I actually haven't started a book since 2014.
Wow.
So it's a very daunting idea, just like starting a novel again. I mean, I don't know if you have this, James, but I really feel like how did I ever write a novel? Like, I've written 4 of them. I'm like, I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So I'm kind of in the idea stage. Something is kind of starting to gel together. I think I keep writing about Korean Americans in LA, and this will be another book about Korean Americans in LA. I think I'm looking at cousins, 2 cousins, like growing up in LA and kind of getting into some stuff together. And I'm also doing some screenwriting, which is nice, because it is work, and it distracts me from the fact that I'm not working on a novel, while also making me feel like a productive member of society.
Perfect. Awesome. So I think that's going to do it for us for time this evening. So to recap, for anybody who might have tuned in late, we have been chatting with James Han Mattson, whose book Reprieve has just come out. He's been in conversation with Steph Cha, whose most recent novel, as she said, is Your House Will Pay, but also just co-edited the Best American Mystery and Suspense 2021 collection with Alafir Burke. We've got copies of all of them in store. So if you have not picked up your copies yet, visit us at murderbooks.com or come visit us in store to pick up your copies. If you missed any part of the chat, once we are done, Facebook and YouTube will archive them so you can rewatch. I also dropped a link to the YouTube link for Tuesday's event with Steph and Alafir and the other contributors from the Anthology, if you guys want to check that out as well. James and Steph, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is great.
My pleasure. Y'all take care and have a good night.
Yeah, congratulations, James.
Thanks. Thank you.